Some men don't grieve loud. They grieve like a well goes dry, quiet, slow, and you don't notice the water's gone until you lower the bucket and it comes up empty. I worked for a man like that. 5 years I watched him eat his supper standing up so he wouldn't have to sit in a chair across from an empty one. 5 years I watched him build fences he didn't need and ride lines that didn't want riding, just to be too tired at night to remember. Then a woman came up our road in a borrowed wagon, with a child on the seat beside her and a kettle wrapped in a quilt, and she said she'd heard we needed somebody to cook. He never meant to keep her past the first hard frost. He told me so himself. Spring, he said, come spring she goes. I've buried a lot of things in my time. I never did learn how to bury the truth of what happened on that ranch, so I'll just tell it, the way it was, the way I wrote it down, night after night, in a book I should have thrown in the stove years ago. The first thing I noticed was that he'd gone the color of old ash, and I'd known Caleb Dawes 7 years and never once seen him afraid. The wagon had stopped in the yard. Late October, the kind of afternoon where the light comes sideways and gold and lies to you about how cold it's fixing to get. I had the gate half-latched and a ewe under my arm that didn't want doctoring, and I looked up because the dogs had gone quiet, which they only did for 2 reasons, snakes and strangers, and there was Caleb standing on the porch with his hand on the post, looking at that wagon like it had come up out of the ground instead of down the road. I followed his eyes. There was a woman holding the reins. Brown coat too thin for the season, a man's hat she'd clearly taken off a man who was no longer using it, and a face that had done a lot of its living indoors recently and not by choice, pale, set, watchful. Pretty in the way a frozen creek is pretty. You don't want to put your weight on it till you're sure. And next to her, wrapped to the chin in a quilt the color of a faded barn, was a little girl. That was what did it to him, not the woman, the child. I knew because I knew what he'd lost, and I knew the math of it. The girl on that wagon seat was about the age his own would have been. I set the ewe down, she bolted, nobody watched her go. You'll be the man advertised for a cook, the woman said. Her voice was lower than I expected and steadier than her hands, which were white-knuckled on the leather. Bill at the mercantile said you'd run through 3 since spring, and the last one left a note that just said good luck. I'll confess that note was real, and that I'd written it as a joke and Bill had not understood it was a joke. Caleb didn't answer her. His jaw worked. I'd seen that look on cattle that have walked too far from water, that flat, far-off look of an animal that stopped expecting anything good and is only now, against its will, being made to hope. Amos, he said to me, quiet, tell her it's filled. It wasn't filled. We'd been eating my biscuits, and my biscuits could be used to shoe a horse. The woman heard him, she had good ears. It's not filled, she said, not unkind, just tired. Bill said this morning it was open. I came 11 miles. She pulled the brake. I'll cook you a supper. If you don't want me after, I'll go and you owe me nothing but the flour. It's filled, Caleb said again, and walked into the house and shut the door. So you understand what kind of man we're dealing with. He'd rather eat my horseshoes till December than sit across a kitchen from a thing the size of his own dead. Now here's where I'll tell you about my failing, since I'm the one telling it. I am a sentimental old fool, and I have never learned to leave well enough alone, and besides, the wind had shifted while we stood there talking, and I'd been on this ground long enough to smell snow coming the way you smell rain in the city. There was weather behind that pretty gold light. Real weather. I looked at the thin coat. I looked at the child. Ma'am, I said, I'm the foreman and I'll tell you the truth, he won't. We do need a cook bad enough I've half a mind to lie down and die of it. But that man's not himself, and you'd best not take what he says to heart, nor too lightly neither. There's a storm coming in tonight'll close the road by morning. You go back now, you might make town. You might not. You stay, there's a bunkhouse cot and a stove, and you can cook us a supper and we'll all argue about the rest of it when the sun's out. She looked at me a long moment, then down at the girl, then at the sky which had begun, very faintly, to go the wrong color in the north. Tess, she said softly, we're getting down. The child didn't speak, just climbed down. I noted that the girl didn't say a word, didn't cry, didn't ask the 100 questions a child her age has loaded and ready. She just got down off the wagon, took up a corner of her mother's coat in her fist and stood. I keep a tally book. Have since the war, when counting was the only thing kept my hands from shaking. I write down what I see. That night by the bunkhouse stove I wrote, woman Mrs. Vance, girl Tess abt 6, girl does not talk, mother does not say why. And then, because I'm honest in that book if nowhere else, I wrote, see afraid of a child, God help us. She cooked us a supper. I'd be lying if I said it was fancy. It wasn't. It was a pot of beans she'd doctored with something molasses, a little of the salt pork we had hanging, an onion, and something green and dried she'd carried in her own bag, sage maybe, I never asked. Cornbread that came out of the pan in one piece, which mine never had. Coffee that didn't taste like the inside of a boot. But you have to understand what food is to men who have been eating their own misery for half a year. The hands came in off the line. There were 6 of us then, before the bad winter took 2 and money took the rest, and they sat down at that long table in the cookhouse, and the first man to take a bite, that was Dutch, he just stopped, held his spoon, looked at it like it had spoken to him. Oh, he said. That was all, just oh, the way you'd say it standing at a graveside or a baptism. Oh, so that's where it went. The men ate like they'd forgotten they were allowed to. Cora Vance stood by the stove with her arms folded and watched them, and there was no triumph in her face, no see, told you. Just a kind of careful relief, like a woman counting coins to see if there's enough. Tess sat in the corner on an overturned crate with a tin plate, and she ate small and quiet, and when she thought no one was looking she slipped half her cornbread into her coat pocket, saving it. A child that saves food in her pocket has been hungry in a way that's gotten into her bones, where it stays even after the table's full. I've seen it in soldiers. I wrote that down too. Caleb did not come to supper. He ate, I happen to know, standing at the kitchen window in the main house, a plate she'd sent over with me. I carried it in and set it down, and he didn't look at it, and I went out. When I came back for the plate, it was clean. He'd eaten every bite standing up in the dark like a man stealing from his own larder. The storm came in around midnight, just like the wind promised. Not a screamer, a steady, patient, burying kind of snow, the kind that means business. By morning the road was a white suggestion. Nobody was going 11 miles to anywhere. So she stayed, not because anybody decided it, because the sky decided it. The first week, Caleb arranged his whole life around not being in a room with her. You wouldn't think a grown man could do it on a working ranch, but grief makes a fellow inventive. He took his coffee before dawn and was gone to the far pasture before she'd lit the stove. He had me carry his meals. He found fence to fix in weather that would freeze the fix solid by sundown. He was, in plain terms, hiding from a woman who cooked his food and a girl who never said one word, and had done nothing to him in this world but exist at the wrong height. Here's the thing about hiding, though. The person you're hiding from learns the shape of your absence, learns it better than your presence would teach them. Cora Vance figured him out inside 3 days. I watched her do it. She started leaving his coffee on the back step in a covered tin so it'd be hot when he passed in the dark. She started sending the meals with a cloth over them and a flat rock on the cloth so the wind wouldn't take it, and I never once told her about the wind, she just knew, the way she knew about the snow. She never asked me a single question about him. But she watched the house, and she watched me, and she put it together out of the silences. On the 5th day she said to me, not looking up from the dough, he lost somebody. I didn't answer, it wasn't mine to tell. A wife, she said. And the child's the trouble, not me. He can't be in a room with the child. She pressed the heel of her hand into the dough hard. I've seen it before. Men come back from somewhere broke that way. You learn to keep the small ones out of their sight till they heal up if they heal. She looked at me then. Does he heal up, your man, or is he the other kind? I've been winding my watch. It's a dead watch, stopped at 4:20 on a day I'd as soon not name. But I wind it anyway, 3 turns, every evening, the way another man might say a prayer he no longer believes but can't give up. I wound it and I thought about her question honest. I don't know, I said. I've been waiting 5 years to find out. She nodded like that was a fair answer and went back to the bread. Now I'll tell you about the night it cracked. Just a hairline, but everything that came after came through that crack. It was the second week, and the cold had settled in for good, and Tess had taken to following me around the barn in the afternoons because I think I was the only one who didn't seem to expect anything of her. She'd watch me doctor the stock and fork hay, and she'd hand me things if I pointed, the rasp, the bucket, the curry comb. And she never said a word, but she had a way of being useful that was almost unnerving in a child. Like she'd learned young that being useful was how you earned your keep in a place that might not keep you. She had a doll, rag thing, no face left on it, just 2 black stitches where eyes had been. She carried it everywhere in her coat, the same coat she hid the cornbread in. And this afternoon she dropped it. We were crossing the yard and the wind took it out of her arms and rolled it under the corral rail and out into the churned, frozen muck where the horses stood. And one of them, a green 3-year-old we called Ringer, was a kicker and a stomper and no animal for a child to be near. Tess went for it. I was too slow and too far and my heart went up into my throat. And then there was a man between her and the horse, fast, low, scooping the child back with one arm and the doll up with the other in the same motion, putting his own body where the hoof would land. Caleb. I hadn't even seen him come. He must have been at the barn the whole time and I never marked him. He came up out of nowhere the way he did everything now, like a man who taught himself not to be seen. He had the girl by the back of the coat. The horse stamped and settled. And Caleb Dawes knelt there in the cold muck with a child in one arm and a faceless doll in the other, and his whole body was shaking, and I don't believe to this day it was the near miss that shook him. He held the doll out to her. Tess looked at it, then at him, and then she did a thing I'd not seen her do in 2 weeks. She reached up, very slow, and she patted his face. Once. The flat of her small, cold hand against that hard man's jaw, the way you gentle a spooked animal, the way her mother gentled the doe. He made a sound. I won't try to spell it. It was the sound a tree makes the moment before it goes over, that long, low groan in the heart of it. And then he set the child down very carefully on her feet, and he stood up and he walked off toward the house, and he did not stop, and he did not look back, and his shoulders, going away from us across the white yard, were shaking still. Tess watched him go. Then she turned and held the doll up to me, like she wanted me to see it was safe. I knelt down. My knees aren't what they were. He saved your Annie there, I said. I named the doll on the spot. I don't know why, it just came. That was a brave thing your Annie did, going under the rail like that, and a foolish one. I tapped the doll's chest. You tell her foolish. And Tess Vance smiled. First smile I'd seen on her. She didn't say foolish. She didn't say anything. But she smiled and she held the doll closer and she put her free hand into mine and we walked back to the cookhouse where her mother was, and the snow came down soft, and somewhere across the yard a broken man was standing at a dark window not eating his supper. I wrote that night, he touched the child. The child touched back. Nobody died. And under it, because I'd had a glass of something by then and was feeling the weight of all the years, spring is a long way off. That was the trouble, see. He'd told her spring, told us all. Come spring she goes. He'd said it like a man setting a fence post, final, deep, not to be moved. He'd said it to keep himself safe, because a thing you're going to lose anyway can't hurt you the way a thing you mean to keep can. I think Cora heard about the spring the very first day, from his own mouth through the door, and I think she built her whole behavior around it. She didn't decorate. She didn't unpack but the one bag. She kept Tess's good shoes wrapped and put away. She cooked like a woman who'd be gone by April and didn't want anybody to suffer the missing of her too bad. She held herself at arm's length from her own life. And the night after the doll, when I carried Caleb his plate, he stopped me at the door. First time he'd spoken to me of her at all. "That woman," he said, not looking at me, looking out the window at the cookhouse light. "She does good work." "Best food this ranch ever ate," I said. "Come spring," he said, "you'll pay her fare and you'll see her and the girl safe to wherever she's got people." His voice was steady as a level. "She's not to stay past the thaw, Amos. I won't have it." And then lower, like it cost him, "I can't. Winter on a ranch is a long argument with God." And that one ran from November clear to the far side of February without a recess. I'll skip the dull of it. The cattle that drifted and the cattle we lost, the line riders coming in with frost in their beards, the morning we found the windmill froze solid, and the morning we found a heifer down in a drift with her calf alive against her flank and the heifer dead, and Cora taking that calf into the cookhouse and raising it by the stove on milk and patience till it could stand. Doggy, the men named it. It followed Tess around like the dogs did. Everything followed that child. Animals know who's safe. What I won't skip is the slow business of a man thawing against his own will. It came in pieces. It came the way the creek opens in spring, not all at once, no, but a crack here, a dark thread of water there, the ice still looking solid right up until the day it isn't. He started taking his breakfast in the cookhouse. Just that. He came in one black morning, stamped the snow off, and he sat down at the far end of the long table, far as he could get and still be at it, and he ate his eggs there among the men instead of standing at his window like a thief. He didn't speak to her. She didn't speak to him. She set his plate down and he nodded at the plate, not at her, and that was the whole of it. But he sat, in a chair, at a table, with a child eating in the corner not 10 feet off. The men weren't fools. They knew what they were watching. They got real interested in their eggs. Then it was that he started fixing things in the cookhouse. The step that had been loose since the Harrison administration. The window that wouldn't latch. The flue that smoked. He did it when she was off to the spring house or hanging wash, so as not to be caught at it, and he never said a word about it, and she never thanked him to his face. But I noticed she started leaving him a second cup of coffee on the rail by whatever he was mending and a slice of something, and he started taking them, and that was a conversation, friends, even if not one word got spoke. And Tess wore him down the way water wears stone, which is to say without seeming to try and without ever once stopping. She didn't crowd him. She'd learned caution in her short, hard life, but she'd appear. He'd be mending harness in the barn and look up and she'd be sitting on a hay bale 6 feet off with the doll Annie in her lap, just present, just watching the way she watched me. And one day I had it from Dutch, who saw it through the barn door and came and told me like he'd witnessed a miracle, which I suppose he had. One day Caleb held out the awl and the wax thread and said, "Gruff, make yourself useful then. Hold this." And she did, and after that she held things for him the way she held them for me. He started teaching her, not in words mostly. He'd show her how a thing was done and she'd do it, how to coil a rope, how to gentle the doggy, how to tell a horse's age by its teeth, which is a thing I've known 40 years and still half guess at. He had a patience with her I'd never have credited, this man who'd been short as a winter day with grown men for 5 years. Patience like he was making up a debt. Like every gentle thing he did for this living child was a coin laid on a grave he couldn't visit. Because he never did visit it. Elinor's grave, and the baby's beside it, up on the little rise east of the house under the one cottonwood. 5 years and I never once saw him go up there. He'd ride past it daily and never turn his head. That's its own kind of grief, the kind that can't bear to be near the proof of itself. Cora found the grave in December. I watched her find it. She'd walked up the rise to get a sight line on a strayed milk cow, and she stopped, and she stood a long while reading the 2 stones, the big one and the small one. And when she came down, her face was closed up tight as a fist, and that night she cooked his favorite. She'd worked out his favorite by then, a thing with dumplings, and she sent it over without a word, and I understood it for what it was. A woman saying I'm sorry in the only language she trusted, which was food, because food can't be taken the wrong way and can't be thrown back in your face. Or it can, but it costs you. Now I should tell you what I learned about her, that long winter, because a story's no good if you only know the one side of it. She told me in pieces, same as he thawed in pieces. Nights by the stove after Tess was down, when the men were gone to the bunkhouse, and there was just the two of us and the fire and the doggy calf breathing in the corner. Her husband had been Daniel Vance, a teamster, then a miner when the freight gave out, down at the Callaway diggings 2 counties over. He'd been, by her telling, not a cruel man but a weak one, which she'd come to think was its own kind of cruelty when there's children depending. He drank. He gambled the drinking money and then the eating money. And he died here. She always got brief, and her hands always found something to do. He died in a cave-in that the men who knew said came of working a face that everybody but the desperate knew was rotten. He'd been desperate. He'd owed. That was the whole of it, I thought. A dead drunk husband and a debt. It was bad enough. It was not the whole of it. The whole of it came in February, and it came in a letter. And the letter came up the road in the hand of a man neither of us wanted to see. But before the letter, there was the night the cattle got into the loco weed. I won't go long on it. Loco's a poison weed, and a few head got into a patch of it where the snow'd blown thin. And by the time we knew it, we had 8 animals staggering and blind and fixing to die. And it was the dead middle of a sub-zero night. And Caleb and me and Dutch, and the 2 hands we had left were out in it trying to drive the sick ones in and dose them and keep the healthy ones off the patch. And it was, in a word, hell. Cora came out. She'd no call to. She was the cook. But she came out into that killing cold in Daniel's old coat with her hair coming down, and she worked the whole night beside us, held lanterns, mixed the doozing drafts I shouted the recipe of, ran hot water from the cookhouse out to where we were fighting a downed steer, came back with coffee that kept 5 men alive on their feet till dawn. She never complained. She never asked to go in. When her hands cracked and bled from the cold and the lie in the dishwater both, she wrapped them in rags and kept on. And Caleb saw her. I mean, he saw her. There was a moment near morning. We'd saved 5 of the 8, lost 3, and we were all of us done in, standing in the gray light steaming like horses, and Cora handed him a cup of coffee, and her hands were wrapped in bloody rags, and he took the cup and he looked at her hands and then he looked at her face, and something went across his own face that I hadn't seen in 5 years and despaired of ever seeing again. It was want, plain human want, not just the bodies, though that too, I'd not pretend otherwise, but the deeper want, the want to not be alone in the gray morning of a hard night, the want of a person who works beside you and doesn't quit. He looked at her like a man looking at water after a long, dry ride. And then he caught himself doing it, and I watched him slam the door on it. I watched it cost him. He set the cup down and said, "Get inside, Mrs. Vance, you'll lose fingers," rough as a cob, and he turned and walked away, and Cora stood there holding the coffee pot, and the look on her face was the same look as his, the want and the slammed door both, and I thought, oh, you pair of fools. You match pair of frightened fools. She said to me low, watching him go, "Come spring." He said, "Come spring," I agreed. He's right to. She wrapped her bleeding hands tighter. I've nothing to offer a man but trouble and a child that won't speak. He's buried a wife and a baby. He doesn't need mine to raise. She said it flat, like reading a price off a board. "Come spring we go, it's better." "Better for who?" I said. She didn't answer that. She went inside. I wound my watch. The dead hands at 4:20. I thought about all the things I'd told myself were better across the years, and how many of them had just been easier, wearing Better's coat. The letter came a week later. It was a Tuesday. I have it in the book. And the man who brought it was a stranger to me, but not, I saw at once, to Cora. She came out of the cookhouse to the sound of the horse, and she stopped dead in the doorway, and the blood went out of her face the way it had gone out of Caleb's that first day. And Tess, who was beside her, took one look at the rider and went behind her mother's skirts and gripped 2 fistfuls of the cloth and pressed her face in and would not look out. A child doesn't hide like that from a stranger. The man was big and well-fed in a country where nobody was either, in a good coat, on a good horse, with a soft, smiling face that didn't reach his eyes. He took off his hat to Cora with a flourish that was somehow worse than rudeness. "Cora," he said, "you're a hard woman to run to ground." He looked past her at the child and the smile got wider. "And there's my brother's girl. Hello, Tessie, don't you know your Uncle Royal?" Tess pressed harder into her mother and made a sound, the only sound I ever heard that child make in all her silence, a thin, high, animal sound of pure fear. Cora put her arm back around the girl without taking her eyes off the man. "You've no business here, Royal." "Now that's where you're wrong." He reached into his good coat and took out a paper, folded and held it up, and even from the porch where I'd come to stand I could see it was a legal-looking thing, all seals and signatures. "I've got business, Cora. I've got Daniel's debts, which I bought up fair and square from the men he owed on account of family looks after family. That smile comes to $400 and some dollars. And I've got," he tapped the paper, "a paper from a judge in Callaway says a fatherless child's better off with her blood kin of means than with a woman who can't pay her dead husband's debts and goes from cookhouse to cookhouse like he let it hang. Well, we're family. I'll be kind about the word." The yard went very quiet. I want to be plain about what was happening because it took me a moment myself. This man, Royal Vance, had bought up Daniel's debts, not out of family feeling but as a leash. $400 Cora couldn't begin to pay, and with the debt in one hand and some bought judge's paper in the other, he meant to take the child. For what reason I didn't yet know and didn't want to. A man whose own niece screams at the sight of him does not want that child for love. Cora knew the reason. I saw it in her, and whatever it was bad enough that her steady hands were not steady now. "You'll not take her," Cora said, her voice shook and held. "I'll pay the debt, give me time." "Time?" Royal laughed soft. "You've a week's wages to your name and a borrowed wagon, come now." He swung down off the horse like he owned the ground. "I'll make it easy, the debt or the girl, even trade, family's generous." And he took a step toward the porch, toward Tess, and his hand came out. And stopped. Because Caleb Dawes had come around the corner of the barn, where he'd been since the horse first sounded, and he was standing now at the bottom of the porch steps between Royal Vance and the child, and he had not raised his voice nor his hand, but there was something in the set of him, something that had been asleep 5 years and was awake now, that made the big man smile finally, for the first time, falter. "Get back on your horse," Caleb said. I'd not heard that voice from him, not ever. It was the voice, I thought, of the man he'd been before the well went dry. Royal Vance looked at him, took his measure, saw a worn rancher in a patched coat on a hard-up spread, and made, I believe, the single worst guess of his life. "And who," he said, smiling again, "the hell are you?" He didn't count loud. He didn't have to. There's a way of saying a number that lets a man know the rest are coming whether he likes it or not. And Caleb had it, and Royal Vance, for all his good coat and his bought paper and his soft, cruel smile, was at bottom the kind of man who only ever pushed where he thought it was safe to push. He could read a hard thing when it finally stood in front of him. But he was cunning, that one. He didn't go for the gun he surely had, and we surely had too. He went for the smarter weapon, which was the law and the lie of it. "You touch me," he said, backing toward his horse easy like it was his idea, "and it's you the marshal comes for, friend, not me. I've got paper. I've got a judge. You're harboring a debtor and a child that's mine by writ. You think a court out here cares for the say-so of some busted-out cattleman over a legal instrument. He got a boot in the stirrup. I'll be in town, at the drover's. You've got till Saturday to hand me $400 or hand me the girl, and if I get neither I come back with the marshal and a warrant, and then it's the both of you in trouble and the child too." He looked at Cora, and the smile was gone now, just the cold left. "You know what I'll do with her, Cora. You know what the place is. Save us all the bother." And he rode off, slow, letting us watch him go. A man who knew that fear does more work over 4 days than a fist does in one. Saturday was 4 days off. We had, I knew to the dollar because I kept the books, $211 to the ranch's name, and every cent of it spoken for, feed to get the surviving stock to grass, the note on the south quarter, wages I owed the 2 hands and Dutch and hadn't paid since Christmas. We'd had a killing winter. We were a hard frost from broke ourselves. $400 might as well have been 4,000. That night the cookhouse was a tomb. Tess wouldn't be put down. She clung to her mother and her mother held her, and neither of them slept, I'd wager. And when I came in late to bank the stove, Cora was sitting up in the lamplight with the child finally heavy and dozing across her lap, and she was looking at nothing, and she said to me without turning her head, "I have to go. Now don't. Listen to me." She turned then, and her face was a thing I'll not forget, calm the way the surface of deep water is calm, with everything terrible underneath. "I know what Royal Vance wants Tess for, and it isn't kindness and it isn't family. There's a place he keeps in Callaway. He uses children in it. I'll not say more, I can't, not with her sleeping right here. But I'll die before he has her, and I'll not let that man bring the law and ruin down on this ranch and on Mr. Dawes, who's done nothing but be decent to us, over my dead husband's debts." Her voice never rose. "So I'll take Tess and I'll go in the night far and fast, and Royal'll follow me and not you, and you'll all be shut of it. It's the only clean way. You tell Mr. Dawes," her voice caught the only place it caught. "You tell him thank you for the step, he'll know." She meant the loose step he'd fixed. The first kind thing he'd done her, done in secret so as not to be caught at it. "He'll come after you," I said. "He won't know which way I went." She stroked the sleeping child's hair. "That's the point of going in the night. I went and got Caleb. I'd no right to, maybe. A man's grief is his own, and so are his decisions. But I'd watched a well go dry for 5 years, and I'd watched it, this one impossible winter, begin against all odds to fill. And I was an old man with a dead watch and no children of my own, and these 3, were the nearest thing to a family I had left in the world. And I was tired, friends. I was so tired of better that was only ever easier. And I went and I woke him, and I told him every word she'd said. He listened in the dark. He didn't interrupt. When I was done he was quiet a long while, and then he got up and pulled on his boots, and he said, "Saddle me the gray." And his voice was the before voice again, and I went out gladder than I'd been in years to do as I was told. But he didn't ride to town, not yet. He rode up the rise, east of the house to the cottonwood, to the 2 stones he'd not gone near in 5 years. I followed at a distance, I'll admit it, because I'm a sentimental old fool, and I'd come too far in this not to see the end. I hung back in the dark and I watched Caleb Dawes get down off the gray and stand over his wife's grave and his baby's grave in the cold starlight, hat in his hands, for the first time since we'd put them there. I didn't hear all he said. The wind took most of it. I heard a little. I heard him say Ellie. I heard him say I'm sorry. I heard, after a long time, something that might have been I think you'd want me to, and might have been the wind. I'll not pretend to more than I know. But he stood there a long while in the cold, and his shoulders shook the way they'd shook the day of the doll. And when he came down off that rise he was a different man than went up it, or the same man finally, the one I'd lost track of, come back. He went to the house. He didn't go to bed. He sat at his desk with the lamp lit and the strongbox open and his papers spread, and I knew without looking what he was doing, because I keep his books, and there was nothing in that box but the deed and the note and a little hard money, and he was reckoning, the way I'd reckoned, that $211 is not 400. In the morning he was gone before light. Took the wagon, took the 2 best horses we had not lost, the matched bays a man would notice. Took Dutch with him. He didn't tell me where. He didn't need to. He sold them. The bays that he'd raised from foals, and that were the last good thing the ranch had to its name, the breeding stock that was meant to dig us out of the hole the winter dug us into. He sold them to the big outfit east of town that had always wanted them and never could get him to part with them. And he sold them cheap, because he needed the money by Saturday. And he came back with $400 cash and 2 empty halters, and a face like a man who set a thing down he'd carried a long way. I'll tell you what that cost in plain terms, because the words he sold the horses don't carry it. Without those bays, the ranch couldn't breed itself back up. It'd take years to recover from the winter now where it might have taken one. He'd very likely lose the south quarter to the note. He'd traded the future of the place he'd built his whole grieving life around, for a woman he'd known one season and her silent child, neither of whom he'd promised one thing, neither of whom he had any earthly claim or duty to. That's the heavy decision if you're keeping count. He made it alone, at his desk in the dark after standing over his dead. He made it, and he never once said out loud that he'd made it. Saturday he rode to town. I went with him and Dutch, all of us armed and hopping not to need it. We found Royal Vance at the drovers, fat and easy, certain. And Caleb Dawes put $400 on the table in front of him and took the debt paper, and the bought judges writ out of the man's coat himself. Royal let him, grinning, thinking he'd won, thinking he'd shaken $400 out of a busted rancher and would be back for more. And Caleb fed both papers into the stove that stood by the drover's bar, and stood there till they were ash, and then he leaned down close to Royal Vance and said something to him, quiet, that I didn't hear and Royal did, and whatever it was, the smile finally, fully, came off that man's face and never, to my knowledge, came back on it in this county again. He was gone by Monday. We never saw him more. I asked Caleb once, years after, what he'd said. He thought about it. Then he said, I told him I knew about the place in Callaway, and I told him I'd written it all down and left it with 3 men, and if the child or her mother ever came to harm, those 3 men would see to it that what I'd written got to the right people. And then I told him I'd buried better men than him for less. Had you written it down? I asked. No, he said, but he didn't know that, and a man like that, he spent his whole life lying. He can't help but believe everybody else is doing it too. Caleb almost smiled. Sometimes the only thing a liar will trust is another lie. But that's getting ahead. We came home Saturday in the dark, the debt burned, the threat gone, 2 good horses poorer and the ranch's whole future hocked to it. And Cora was waiting in the cookhouse doorway with the lamp behind her, and Tess beside her, both of them dressed to travel, the one bag packed because Cora hadn't known, you see. She'd been ready to run all the same. She meant to go that very night regardless. Caleb got down off the gray. The 2 of them looked at each other across the lit yard, and there was the whole winter in it. The eggs and the step and the locoweed night and the doll and the coffee left on the rail. And there was the dead wife on the rise and the dead husband in the Callaway ground. And there was the want and the slammed door, all of it, in one long look across the snow. It's done, he said. The debt's burned, the writ's burned, he's gone, he won't come back. He stood there with the empty halter still in his hand. I think he'd forgot he was holding it. You don't have to run. Cora looked at the empty halter. She'd been on this ranch a season. She knew what wasn't standing in the corral. The bays, she said. Are sold, he said. For $400, she said. For what they fetched, he said. And Cora Vance, who I'd watched work a killing night without one word of complaint, who'd wrapped her bleeding hands in rags and kept on, who'd faced down Royal Vance on that porch with her voice shaking and holding both at once. Cora Vance put her hand over her mouth and made a sound, and the steady went out of her all at once, all the steady of that whole hard season, and Caleb crossed the yard and she went into him like a woman going into a doorway out of weather, and he held her. And I turned away because some things a man's got no business watching, even a sentimental old fool who'd helped bring them about. Tess stood by the lamp, watching them, the doll Annie in her arms. And then she walked across the yard to where they stood, and she pulled at Caleb's coat till he looked down at her, and Tess Vance opened her mouth, and in a voice rusty from a year of silence, a small, clear voice none of us had ever heard, she said one word. She said stay. I don't know if she meant it for us or for them or for herself or for the going that wasn't going to happen now. I never asked. Some things you leave be. He never meant to fall in love with the woman he hired to cook. He told me so himself, that first day, come spring she goes, and he meant it the way you mean a thing you've built your whole survival on. Spring came, she didn't go. They were married under the cottonwood on the rise, which I thought strange till I understood it, that he wanted Ellie there for it, that it wasn't a betrayal of his dead but a kind of asking of them, and that Cora understood that too and stood for it, which is the truest thing I can tell you about the woman. The dogie calf got loose in the middle of the vows and Tess laughed out loud, a real child's laugh, and nobody minded. The ranch came back slow. It took more than the 1 year. We lost the south quarter like I feared, but we kept the rest, and the rest was enough, and in time there were the new horses, never as fine as the bays, but the bays had bought something the bays never could have, so I call it a fair trade, and so did he. I'm an old man now, older than this story. My watch is still dead at 20 past 4, and I still wind it 3 turns of an evening, though I'll tell you a secret. I don't rightly remember any more what happened at 20 past 4, the day it stopped. Some grief you carry so long it wears smooth and you forget the shape of the thing that cut you. That's not the worst way for it to go. I keep my tally book still. The last thing I wrote in it about that winter, I wrote the morning after the night the child spoke, and I'll close with it, because I can't say it better than I did then, half asleep and undone by the whole long business of watching a well come back to water against every law I knew.